Happy Father's Day. I know, Father's Day isn't for 140 days. It's June 16th. I'm well aware. It just occurs to me that we should celebrate fathers more than once a year, don't you think? Don't you think that any parent, a mom or a dad who is dedicated, who is disciplined, who is responsible, who takes on the weight, the responsibility of raising the next generation, we should celebrate them as often as we can. We should encourage them and affirm them. Yeah, that's some weak encouragement right there. You agree with that? You ever wonder why in the Bible God self-identifies as a father? Now, I have a number of theories about that, and a couple of them are crackpot theories. But the best theory I have about why God identifies as a father is to say to men who are fathers, you have a sacred responsibility. I am trusting you in my stead with the lives and the hearts and the souls of the next generation. Your calling is a high calling to be me for your children. Now, God doesn't say that to marginalize women. Don't get the wrong idea. It's not misogynistic or some patriarchal structure or some form of male privilege. It's possible for us to affirm men who are dedicated dads and faithful fathers and appreciate mothers and appreciate children and grandparents and singles and people who aren't married and people who will never have kids. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. But it's worth remembering that God throws down the bar and the gauntlet to the men and says, if you're going to be a dad, it is a sacred responsibility. I spent the last couple of weeks researching what is the impact of fathers on a generation of children. And I tried to come up with 100 years of data that would show what difference a dad makes in their child's lives. And I got about halfway through that study of looking at U.S. Census Bureau data and American Psychological Association data and Bureau of Labor Statistics and all the statistics that I could find. And I don't know if you're aware that the internet is like endless. And I got halfway through that and I got terrified. Because the statistics tell a terrifying story. Over the last 100 years in America, the percentage of single-parent homes has increased by 132%. In the same amount of time, the percentage of two-parent families has only increased by 16%. And of the single-parent families today, in 2022, this is the most recent data I found, 80% of the single-parent family homes are led almost exclusively by moms, which means that 80% of the fathers are walking away from their responsibilities. That's 14.3 million children raised without dads. And the statistics of the outcomes of their absence are depressing. They're overwhelming. I had a page of them, and I thought, I'll share the statistics with you. But I said, nobody will survive it. It's too disappointing. It's too discouraging. And I came to the conclusion that any society where fathers are neglecting and abdicating their responsibility to be available and to invest in their children is a society in decay. It is a culture in decline. And if there is anywhere in a declining culture that ought to champion and encourage and challenge fathers to be faithful and dads to be excellent, it's here. We began this year with a sort of a re-examination, a revisiting of why do we do this? Why does Riverbend even exist? What is our purpose? What is our mission? And we're breaking it down to the chromosomal level and the DNA of Riverbend Church is laid out for us in one chapter of the Bible, Luke chapter 15. You want to know why we are here, why we do what we do, what is our mission and our purpose? It's categorized in a story, 3 stories actually, 3 parables that Jesus told in Luke 15. The parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost son, silver, and the parable of the lost son. Last week, Stephanie Rollins brilliantly introduced us to the 3rd story, the story of the prodigal son. But the story of the prodigal son is not simply a story about the son. It's also a story about the father of the prodigal. And part of our mission is to learn the lessons of what it means to be excellent at caring for the next generation from the lessons of the father of the prodigal son. And today, I want to tell you what I have learned from studying that story. But before I share those with you, would you pray with me for a moment? Father in heaven, I would ask that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in your sight, and that you would use your words spoken by your servant and anointed by your Spirit to challenge us as parents and as people to excellence in investing in the children and in the next generation that you have entrusted to us. Pray for all of us, parents and not, fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, for each of us to accept this challenge and this sacred responsibility. Pray this for myself and for my family and for all of us here, for I ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. Throughout art history, the church has been a sponsor of some of the greatest art that has ever been created. For 2,000 years, the church has been the patron that has created some of the greatest music, the greatest architecture, and the greatest visual art that has ever been made. And this was particularly true during a 300-year period that art historians call the Renaissance and the Romantic periods, from the early 1600s to the early 1900s. And during this time, some of the greatest painters who have ever lived did work representing stories and images from the pages of the Bible. And many of the great artists of those periods were asked to create representations of the story of the prodigal son. And the interesting thing is that 90%, 9 out of 10 of them, most of them, represented the story of the prodigal son by giving us a picture of one single moment, the moment the son returned home. This is a painting by Giovanni Francesco Barbieri. It's a beautiful painting from 1619 that portrays the return of the prodigal son. Govert Flinck, a Dutch artist in 1642, painted this painting, typical of the Romantic period. My favorite is this one by Bartolomé Esteban Murillo, a Spanish painter who in 1670 painted this, the restoration and the return of the prodigal son. I saw that painting when I visited the Prado in Madrid probably 40 years ago. A British artist named William Eddy did a painting in the Romantic style in 1625, The Return of the Prodigal. And a French artist named Jean-Jacques Tissot actually did a series of 3 paintings. The first painting was called The Departure. The second painting was called In Foreign Lands. And the third painting was this one. It was painted in 1882. And it is the return of the prodigal in modern times. But far and away, the painting that has garnered the most praise from art historians is the one that was painted by Rembrandt van Rijn in 1667. And what's interesting is what has been preserved in Rembrandt's memoirs are some of the initial sketches that he did as he was studying how he might render the image of the return of the prodigal son. The first one was from 1633. The next one was from 1642. It's a much more detailed drawing. And the last sketch was from 1646. But it was the painting that he unveiled in 1667, 34 years after his first sketch, that was finished 2 years before his death in 1667, that many art critics believe is the finest of Rembrandt's works. Now, I disagree with that. I actually think the finest Rembrandt is the Rembrandt of the Storm on the Sea of Galilee. But art critics believe the detail and the tone and the imagery of Rembrandt's Return of the Prodigal Son is the finest painting he ever had. See, this is the passionate center of the story of the Father, the return of the Son. But there are lessons to be learned about the character of a great father throughout the story of the prodigal. And I want to share with you 4 lessons that I have learned from studying the father of the prodigal son. There are 4 attributes, 4 characteristics of what I call a faithful father, the best and the wisest of fathers. A faithful father, it develops in his children, first of all, trust. Trust is a fragile thing. We're born trusting. We have to. As infants, we don't have a choice but to trust our parents, to trust the environment. We can't fend for ourselves. I remember when our first daughter was born, we were living in a very tiny apartment in East Dallas, and we didn't have a place for her, so we made her nursery into the laundry room became the nursery. It was actually the back porch of our house. And the changing table was our dryer. And as soon as she learned to stand up when I would change her diapers on the dryer, I would stand her up and she would dive to me. We called it dryer diving. And I would back up and she would just fearlessly dive to me. And I remember one day she had one of those particularly toxic diapers, the kind that should be classified as like toxic waste material. She had one of those blasters. And so I'm cleaning her up and I get it and I gotta put it away because if it's out and the aroma will like overcome the house. So I'm putting it away, and as I'm bending over, she stands up and leaps off the dryer. And I reached out and Jerry Riced her with one arm and saved her, and I'm like, she didn't know how not to trust. But we quickly learned that it is a father's responsibility to reignite trust in their children, to teach them what trust looks like. You see, trust is developed in our children in 2 different ways. First of all, it's earned. We earn their trust by being trustworthy. It is the responsibility of a great dad to keep his word, to do what he says he's going to do. If you say you're going to be there, be there. If you are present, be fully present. Let your children know that you are trustworthy because you have to earn that trust. They have to relearn it. It has to be developed in them. But trust is not just earned, trust is also taught. It is learned. And there are 2 ways that we teach our children trust. The first one is we teach them how to think. We teach them what to think. The first thing we do with our children is we teach them what to think. We teach fire hot, knife sharp, sister not punching bag. We teach them sort of the values and the dangers of life. But the goal of a father is not simply to teach his children what to think. The goal of a father is to teach them how to think so that they can think for themselves. And the way that we do that is through the question, why? If you've ever had a toddler or a preschooler in your home, you know that their favorite question is why. It's time for you to go to bed. Why? It's time for you to eat your cereal. Why? You shouldn't hit your sister. Why? Those are the appropriate questions that a father responds to, because a father's responsibility is to build trust in their children and to teach them not just what to think, but how to think. It's what God does with us. It's how God teaches us. Look at the Bible. God gives us the Bible, and we imagine that the goal of the Bible is to tell us what to think. But it's not. The goal of the Bible is to teach us how to think. And so when you come to the Word, and you can tell a lot about a person's spiritual maturity, if all they care about is the what, And they never asked the why. That's a revelation. In the story of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15, down in verse 11, it says that the man had 2 sons. And the younger son came to his father and said, "Give me my share of the inheritance, my share of the estate." That would have meant that he was entitled to 1/3 of the father's assets. That would have also meant that he was disrespecting his father. He was insulting his father. Because you don't get your inheritance until the parent is dead. So basically what he was saying to his father by implication is, "I wish you were dead." And what does the father do? The father divided his assets and gave his son his inheritance. Why did he do that? That's the right question to ask. Why in the wide world of sports would the father trust his younger son with 1/3 of his inheritance? Was it because he was so trustworthy? No, he proved that wasn't true. I'm convinced the reason why the father trusted his younger son with his share of the inheritance is the same reason God trusts us. That we might think for ourselves, that we might learn what trust looks like. He says, "I trust you with this." And God says that to us because the goal of a great father is to teach your children how to think for themselves. It's the way we cultivate trust, is teaching them not what to think, but how to think, and to think for themselves. You think I really wish that my kids thought everything I thought. Wouldn't that be great? If your children just grew up and they thought like you politically, they thought like you financially, they thought like you spiritually, they even dressed like you. Are you kidding me? Are you serious? That'd be ridiculous. You want them to be as dumb as we are? No, the idea is to put them on our shoulders and not just teach them what is true, but teach them how to figure it out for themselves. Dedicated dads and faithful fathers teach their children how to think for themselves. They develop trust. They trust them and develop trust in them. The second lesson I learned from the father is that faithful fathers and dedicated dads have a courageous, a ferocious, almost a reckless patience. That patience is an attribute of a dedicated father. Look at the story in Luke chapter 15, down in verse 13. It says that it wasn't long after the son, the younger brother, received his inheritance that he went off to a distant land. He took off. And it didn't take him long before he had wasted, and I like how the King James says it. It says he squandered his wealth in riotous living. As Stephanie Rollins pointed out brilliantly last week, that's not a crime. Stupidity is not a crime. If stupid were a crime, we'd all be in prison. But the reality is he just wasted it. And then it went from bad to worse. Not only had he wasted his fortune, and not only was he broke, there was a great famine in the land, and there was no work, and he began to starve. And then in the most graphic of ways, Jesus describes the plight of this young man and says that he decided the only way he could survive was to sell himself into slavery to a man who raised pigs. I mean, if you're a young Jewish boy, there is nothing lower than feeding pigs. Pigs were unclean animals. He wasn't even supposed to associate with them, much less care for them. I don't think there's anything harder for a parent to do, anything more difficult for a father to do than to be patient with his children, to wait for them. But what does God do with us? God waits for us. God, where is the father in this story Think about it for a minute. The son goes off to a distant land. He goes broke. It might have taken him, depends on how wealthy he was, it may have taken him a few years to lose all of his wealth. It may have taken him a few months to come to the point where he sold himself to work as a pig farmer. And where was Dad? I mean, I know they didn't have FaceTime or social media, so he couldn't really find out how his son was doing. But our inclination in a culture that bubble wraps our kids, in our culture of helicopter parents, was say, you're supposed to go rescue him. But that's not how God operates with us. God waits for us. God waits. And it's what's called free will. You understand how that works? God said, this is your bed. You lie in it. I gave you the ability to think for yourself. And the second attribute of a great father is they allow their children to find their own way. It's one of the hardest things we have to do as dads. It's one of the most difficult things to do as a parent. But it's what God does with us. He says, I raised you to think for yourself, and you have the ability to find your own way. I talk to parents all the time, parents who are racked with guilt, who are ashamed because their children as adults are living lives that they can't endorse. Some of them are living self-destructive lives. Many of them are living lives outside of the faith in which they are raised. And the parents come to me and they say, Dave, have I failed as a parent? I feel guilt and I feel regret that I wasn't a better mom or a better dad. And I say, that's not the point. Because if you are a failure, then God is a failure. And God is not a failure as a father. Our responsibility as parents, and specifically as dads, is to teach our children to think for themselves and teach our children to find their own way. It requires trust. It requires patience. The third thing that it requires is compassion. The story in Luke chapter 15 says that the son finally came to his senses. It says when he came to his senses, he realized, wait a minute, the servants in my father's household have more than enough food to spare. What am I doing here feeding pigs? I know what I'll do. I'll go home and I'll say to my father, I have sinned against heaven and I've sinned against you, and I am no longer worthy to even be called your son. Receive me back as a servant, as a slave. And he decided to set off for home. His name is Jason Bradley DeFord. And he is probably the least likely country singer you will ever see, because he began his career as a rap artist, and his rap name is Jelly Roll. And in 2022, Jelly Roll produced an album called Ballads of the Broken, and it won 3 CMT awards, was nominated for 2 Grammy Awards, and had a song that set the record for the longest time on the Billboard Emerging Artists charts for over 6 months. It was #1, and the song is called Son of a Sinner. And in this song, Jelly Roll, Jason DeFord says this: I'm just a long-haired son of a sinner, searching for new ways I can get gone. I'm a pedal to the highway. If you ever wonder why we write these songs, it's because I'm 1 drink away from the devil. I'm only 1 call away from home. Yeah, I'm somewhere in the middle. I guess I'm just a little right and wrong. See, Jelly Roll gets it. It's the same as the song that Scott sang. See, God is the hound of heaven. God chases us, but God does not overtake us. When he says God is just 1 call away from home, God is right there. But God pursues us without overtaking us. It's the image that all of the great masters tried to capture. It's what Stephanie Rollins said last week was her favorite part of the story of the return of the prodigal son. It's there in verse 20 of Luke chapter 15, where it says, while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and he ran to him. The only time in the entire Bible when God is in a hurry is to embrace the prodigal. It runs to him and it says he was filled with compassion and he embraced him and he kissed him. The attribute of a great dad is that he has unlimited, unconditional, gracious compassion. And that compassion receives and forgives his broken children eagerly, enthusiastically, quickly. There's a fourth thing I learned from the father of the prodigal son, and that is that a dedicated dad, a faithful father, the best and the wisest of fathers, are enthusiastic, they are extravagant, they are explicit in their affirmation. I grew up in a home, I don't know if any of you grew up in a home, where I love you was not something we said all the time. In fact, I never remember my father ever saying it. It's kind of a thing, and I've learned to understand it. I think my dad is of the mindset, and I'm kind of the mindset that we use love for I love pizza. I love Chick-fil-A nuggets. I love that the Cowboys break my heart every year. I mean, we have all of these, we dilute the word love because we apply it to so many different things. And you get in the mindset as if I have to tell you, then I'm not showing you. But my father had a substitute phrase for I love you. And it went like this: I'm proud of you. And I learned as a teenager that when my dad said, I'm proud of you, he was saying the same thing as saying, I love you, because affirmation is the language of love. The story of the prodigal son, as the son is embraced by the father, he tries to get out his soliloquy, his confession. He says, Father, I know I've sinned against heaven and I've sinned against you. And I'm not worthy to be called your son, but if you could just receive me back as even a servant. And it's almost as if the father puts his finger on his son's lips. There's a big but there. He says, but the father turned and said to his servants, quick, get the finest robe and put it on my son. Get the ring, the signet ring that represents his authority, my authority in the marketplace, and put it on his hand. Put sandals on his feet because he came without shoes. Give him sandals and slaughter the fatted calf. The calf that we have been raising since it was young for a special occasion. We've fed it the finest of grains. We've kept it groomed so that for the greatest of celebrations, it would be how we celebrated. And he says, prepare the fatted calf. Because this son of mine, who was dead, is now alive, who was lost, is now found, and the party began. It is the ultimate affirmation. It is the role of a father to affirm and to validate his children conspicuously, explicitly, extravagantly, to praise and to validate his children. This painting that came out here earlier is a drawing that my daughter did when she was 6 years old. It was a drawing that she did for a contest at her grade school. It was a contest that challenged the grade schoolers to do a drawing that would be made into the T-shirt for the field day at the end of the year. And I remember my daughter came home and she was devastated because she didn't win. Now, as a father, as a parent, when our kids come home, we're tempted to go, do you know what you put me through? Do you understand what it was like raising you? Do you realize what a pain in every part of my body you were? I'm glad you came home, but let me make it clear. You owe me. I could have said that about her drawing. I mean, if you look at her drawing, it's terrible. It's absolutely awful. I mean, the perspective is off. The kid is running like this. The J is backward in Trojans and starting lines misspelled. And she said, Dad, I tried my hardest and I didn't win. I said, it's beautiful, honey. I went to Hobby Lobby and I bought that ribbon and I put it on there and I had it frame it. And it's hung in my office for almost 40 years. Because you can never over-validate the value and the preciousness of your own children. Because that's what great dads do. They enthusiastically, they explicitly celebrate and validate their children. This is not a masterpiece. Hardly is it a masterpiece. But some of the great works of the great masters that represent the return of the prodigal son, we would consider them masterpieces. In fact, in contemporary art, there are artists. If you go to the Dallas Museum of Biblical Art, you can see a painting that is painted by an artist named Jorge Santangelo. It's what he calls a Sacro-Cubist style. It's one of my favorite contemporary paintings of the return of the prodigal son. There's an Atlanta artist named Wayne Pascal who painted sort of an abstract painting of the return of the prodigal son that I really like. But if you want to be reminded of the image of what a great dad looks like, all you have to do is walk into our building. Because there on the wall is a mural that was painted in 1999 by Gregory Truett Smith. It represents the return of the prodigal son. In fact, it's a tribute to a painting that was done 350 years earlier by an Italian Renaissance master named Pompeo Gerlone Battoni. And in that painting, it represents the passion and the purity of a great father. We began 2024 by endeavoring to remind ourselves, why do we do what we do? What is our mission? Our mission is a mission of restoration of the lost sheep. But we are the sheep and the shepherds. The sheep are the shepherds. It is the valuing of the lost silver, but we are not just the one who searches for the silver. We are the priceless individuals. We are the priceless coins. And our mission is the mission of the prodigal. Because not only are we to embrace the prodigals, we are the prodigals. And we are the father. And so the attributes of a father, trust and compassion, trust and patience and compassion and affirmation, are attributes not just of the men who are dads in our church, but our church as a community, as a family. We are to represent the values of what makes a great father to those in our community and to each other. This is a hard message for me to preach. It's difficult because I don't want to come across as self-congratulatory. But I want you to understand that my highest calling is not to be the pastor of this church. My most sacred responsibility is not to be a great preacher. My most sacred responsibility and the greatest challenge of my life is to be a great dad. And I believe that fathers who are faithful and dads who are dedicated are worth celebrating more than once a year. I believe that this should be a place that remembers and celebrates great fathers, because I have a theory, and I don't have the statistics to back it up, But just like a society where fathers are abdicating their responsibility can be measured in decline and in decay, so can a church. The mark of a healthy church is a church that is populated by dedicated dads and faithful fathers. That is part of our mission and our vision, part of our calling. Happy Father's Day.